Welcome everyone who's just joining us. We're going to be starting in about a minute just to let all the participants get into the meeting. My name is Mary-Ann Stevenson. I'm Director of the Women's Budget Group. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. Just do a welcome message. Okay, welcome, good afternoon, thank you for joining us. My name is Mary-Ann Stevenson. I am the Director of the UK Women's Budget Group. This meeting has been organised jointly by the Women's Budget Group and Coventry Women's Partnership in collaboration with Southall Black Sisters, Women for Refugee Women and the Latin American Women's Rights Service. We've got a great panel here with us today. We have Kate Osamor, MP, who's chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on No Recourse to Public Funds. We have Sarah Rees from the UK Women's Budget Group. We have Pragna Patel from Southall Black Sisters. We have Elizabeth Jiménez from the Latin American Women's Rights Service. Priscilla Dudhia from Women for Refugee Women, and Noreen Bakari from Southall Women's Training. In a minute, I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves and say a little bit about the organisation that they work for. But first, I want to say a little bit about this project and some housekeeping for this meeting. So this event is, well, it was originally intended to be one of a series of parliamentary events that have been jointly organised by the Women's Budget Group with Coventry Women's Partnership as part of an ongoing project funded by the Smallwood Trust. Coventry Women's Partnership is a group of frontline women's organisations in Coventry that have come together to improve the lives of women living in Coventry. And Noreen is here from Foleshill Women's Training, who's one of the partners in that partnership. As part of this project, the Women's Budget Group has been working with these organisations to produce a series of reports about issues that they and the women they work with have identified as important to them. So we've produced a report on poverty, we've produced a report on funding for the women's voluntary sector, our last report was on housing, and this report now on migrant women. We're currently working on a report on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on women in Coventry, which should be out in June. And as I said, this project has been possible thanks to the generous support of the Smallwood Trust. So we're very grateful for that. The bulk of the report was written before the COVID-19 crisis, but as you will see from the discussion today, the crisis has thrown many of the issues raised in the report into stark relief, and our panellists will talk about that in more detail. So some basic housekeeping. Rather than ask the panellists to prepare short presentations, which doesn't really work on Zoom, what we're going to do is ask a series of questions of them and give them a chance to answer in turn. There's also an opportunity to for the audience to ask questions. So if you are familiar with chat with Zoom, you will know that there is a chat box at the bottom where you can click on and you can take part in the chat with everybody and you can post your questions there. Jenna Norman from the Women's Budget Group is going to be monitoring the chat, and I'll go to her from time to time to pick up on questions. We've disabled the questions function on Zoom because the problem with that is the questions appear right in the middle of the screen, so it's very difficult for panellists to read them and pay attention to their screen at the same time. We're also going to be live tweeting, and so you can follow us on Twitter, and we will finish at 2 o'clock. So but what I'm going to do without further ado is just ask our panellists to introduce themselves and their organisation just with one sentence before we go on to the first question. So I'm going to start just in the order people are on my screen. So Pragna, can you go first?
Okay, so I'm Pragna Patel, Director of Southall Black Sisters. SBS, otherwise known as, is an organisation that's been going for 40 years and specialises in providing advocacy and campaigning services to BME women of all backgrounds. We focus specifically on Vogue issues and the way in which they relate to other socioeconomic matters.
Thank you. Noreen? Noreen, your mic's off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi everybody, my name is Noreen Bakari. I'm the Health and Integration Manager for an organisation called After Beauty. We're based in Coventry and we've been running for 30 years. We're a voluntary organisation. We support women through social, education, employability and health. And we have various projects that are funded externally, European funding, local government, local health trusts and various partnerships. And we support women moving forward. And we're also the lead partner for Coventry Women's Partnership. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the Women's Budget Group team for organizing this event and for having me. I'm Elizabeth Jiménez and I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator on Vogue at the Latin American Women's Rights Service. LORS is a by and for feminist and human rights organization addressing practical and strategic needs of Latin American migrant women living in the UK. We support women and girls facing violence, exploitation and trafficking, and those enduring difficult living and working conditions in low-paid jobs, and those facing intersecting barriers to social protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Rees, Head of Research and Policy at the Women's Budget Group and author also of the report that we're launching today. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Women's Budget Group, we're a network of feminist economists, activists and academics who have an interest in scrutinizing public policy from a feminist lens.
Thank you. Priscilla?
Hi, Priscilla. I'm the Policy Coordinator for Destitution at Women for Refugee Women. We provide support to asylum-seeking women to tell their own stories of persecution and to challenge the injustices of the asylum system. We're a London-based charity, but we work closely with grassroots groups throughout the UK that provide direct assistance to asylum-seeking women. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. And Kate?
Hi everyone, thank you to the Women's Budget Group for making sure that this event took place. I'm the MP for Edmonton. I first got elected in 2015 and amongst many other hats, I wear the hat proudly of the chair of the all-party group for No Recourse to Public Funds.
Thank you very much. I was going to say to people in the audience, if you want to introduce yourself on chat, please feel free to do so, and please feel free to use the chat function to have that discussion while the panelists are speaking. I know some people will be following and live tweeting, but the chat function is also there in the room. And unlike a real meeting, you chatting won't disturb us because we can ignore it, but then come to it and look at it and see what people are writing. So if there's any links or reports or news items or anything else that you think it would be useful to share with the panel, please do so. We are recording this and we will be making the video of the recording available on our website. That won't include the chat, it will just include the panelists. So nothing you say on the chat is going to be shared beyond those taking part in the meeting. Although obviously we don't know who is taking part in the meeting, so that's the usual caveats there. So the first question is really focused on the current situation we're in, and for all of us, COVID-19 is the most urgent situation on our minds. And so I wanted to start by asking Sarah to say a little bit about the report that the Women's Budget Group has produced, and in particular, what are the issues in that report that the COVID-19 crisis has really highlighted?
Sure, thank you, Marianne. So I thought it would be useful to start with giving an overview of the position of migrant women in the economy, and because many of the issues that we are seeing now resulting from the impact of the COVID-19 crisis are a result of that position in the economy. So we already know that women are at higher risk of exposure in their jobs because they represent 77% of workers in high exposure sectors. This includes things like health, social care, but also customer-facing roles like retail, hospitality, and catering, etc. And migrant women are also overrepresented in these sectors. And many of these sectors, particularly the last ones that I mentioned, are the ones bearing the brunt of the shutdown. And so, for instance, cleaning is another sector which has been heavily affected by the lockdown, and where we know that a quarter of the workforce are migrants, and these are mostly women. And so these cleaning as other sectors mentioned, like retail, like hospitality, etc., are sectors where 0 hours contracts, bogus self-employment are very usual in the best of times. And so we know that these are very precarious conditions, working conditions, and even though workers in 0 hours contracts can be put on furlough, even migrant workers who have no recourse to public funds, they can have access to these government supporting schemes. They are actually more likely to see their hours cut or to be dismissed altogether. And so this is even worse when we think that migrant women, they don't have a safety net to fall back on. So most migrant women have no recourse to public funds, which means that, contrary to many low-paid British workers, they cannot apply to things like universal credit or tax credits or housing benefit to supplement their earnings. And so this means that even in non-crisis circumstances, in-work poverty is rife for migrant women. And then we also have the sectors which are at the forefront of fighting this virus. So our social care sector, our NHS, they are heavily dependent on the labor, skills, and experience of both migrants and women. So for instance, the NHS workforce, 77% is women, and migrants account for over 13% of workers in the NHS. So that means they are overrepresented because they are roughly 8% of the whole population. And when we look into social care, which can be sort of considered as a second frontline on this crisis, and also the poor cousin of the healthcare system, because it's been ravaged by the virus, but also received delayed attention from government. So the workforce of social care is predominantly women as well, and migrants are also overrepresented, making up 16% of the workforce. And we know that care workers are highly exposed to the virus, and access to PPE has even been worse than what we've seen in the NHS. And so I think, at this particular point in time, it seems even more unfair that many people who are at the forefront of this crisis, who are saving lives, who are caring for our most vulnerable members in society, they are being effectively asked to pay twice for the NHS through their taxes and through the immigration health surcharge, which is a requirement for any visa into the UK.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Sarah. What we've done with this, obviously a lot of the issues that we're talking about today are interlinked, but I've asked the panelists to focus on a particular area just so that each area gets particular attention. So I'm going to ask Pragna now to talk about the issues that Southall Black Sisters are seeing, particularly around violence against women.
Thank you. Following on from what Sarah's saying, I think one of the things that really strikes us from the point of providing frontline services for some of the most vulnerable women, BME women, and particularly migrant women with no recourse, is the fact that, you know, there's been a lot of government measures being put into place to deal with, and some recognition that migrant women in particular are on the front line. There's been no recognition of the impact of migrant women as users of services. And that's where we come in, because we all know that violence against women, all forms of violence against women, rise in periods of crisis. And in this crisis, there is evidence from multiple sources that show that violence against women and girls has increased. And there have been a spike in domestic homicides. There have been increased levels of reporting to various women's organizations, including our own. We've seen a 10% rise in reporting. But aside from the rise, what we've also seen is the need to support more migrant women for longer, because levels of distress as a result of being trapped in violent relationships and by abusive households have increased. So levels of distress, levels of anxiety, levels of uncertainty, they have all increased. And what we're seeing is that migrant women, particularly with no recourse, have been left behind in all the measures that have been introduced to try and particularly protect women. And in the context of VOG, we're really, really disappointed and shocked, finally, appalled, in fact, by the way in which VOG and migrant women with no recourse to public funds has just been invisibilized. What we are seeing is 60% of our users are migrant women with no recourse to public funds. We already know the ways in which no recourse means that women can't access social housing and welfare benefits. And in this period of crisis, what we're seeing is that more and more women remain trapped. When they report, particularly to the statutory agencies, what they're being told is that they should stay put. Social services, the police, even IDVA services, it's come to our attention, have told migrant women with no recourse, stay where you are or return to your abusive household, because there's nothing we can do for you. Just last weekend, we had a case of a police officer ringing us from Bradford, and that officer found us, found our phone number as a result of being involved in a case that we were working on 10 years ago. And that officer said, we have a woman from Bradford with 2 young children under 5 who were abused and abandoned in Pakistan. The British Red Cross has rescued them, put them on a flight, and I have spent the whole day trying to find an agency to help them when they get back to the UK. And I am asking you, because I've had no success with agencies or with the forced marriage unit, whether you will step in and help this woman. So on a Sunday, one of our advocates had to go to the airport, pick up the woman and 2 children, and using our funds that we have built up to deal with crisis situations and no recourse women, put her up in a hotel. And it is really, really obvious and clear that agencies, statutory agencies, but also many voluntary agencies, for a number of reasons, are not able to support women who are already isolated, who are already marginalized, who are already discriminated, and then find themselves in situations where the crisis is exacerbated for them. And so, you know, I'll come back to later, Marianne, to talk about, you know, what some of these measures have meant or not meant. But we are finding that this is not just a public health crisis, this is a VOG crisis. And it is a crisis for migrant women, particularly with no recourse, to which you know, very, very few people are willing to, people are willing to address. And just as a last point, I really want to say that the burden, the responsibility of protecting and keeping migrant women with no recourse safe has fallen on BME specialist groups who are already struggling with resources and with funding. So, you know, we're facing a double whammy in terms of both supporting migrant women, but also having the resources that we need to support migrant women.
Thank you very much, Pragna. Elizabeth, you were going to talk from the perspective of the Latin American Women's Rights Service, particularly about women who are in vulnerable employment situations.
Yes, thank you. So after the lockdown was imposed, we moved our services to remote provision. Since the first days of it, we have seen an increasing number of calls and more complex cases in regards to labor rights violations. As a matter of context, many Latin American women living in the UK live in work poverty, are overrepresented in low-paid sectors such as cleaning, hospitality, and domestic work. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that despite the social distancing guidance, many migrant women are having to continue to work, although having underlying health conditions, living with at-risk people, or having childcare responsibilities as the result of the lack of social protection and support from the government. Women calling our helplines are reporting issues related to not being paid statutory sick pay or not being able to qualify for it since they work in low-pay and insecure jobs. We have heard from an increasing number of women who are showing symptoms of COVID-19 or have pre-existing conditions who are forced to choose between their health and their salary. Women working at the front line, such as cleaners, have disclosed not being given any personal protective equipment while having their hour cuts. Considering that the furlough scheme is not mandatory, many migrant women are getting dismissed from their jobs, losing their income, and living at risk of destitution. As a result of the no recourse to public funds policy, many of our service users are prevented from applying to most social security benefits, particularly to universal credit. Further, as a result of the illegal working offense, women workers with insecure immigration status are particularly vulnerable, at risk of exploitation, and at the mercy of their employers, not being able to report employment rights breaches or claim better conditions. In general, we are dealing with a lot of misinformation, and we know this is caused by the complexity to understand how the schemes works, but also as consequence of the absence of accessible translated information on this. At LORS, with the support of our community activist group, WARMI, we have been identifying, translating, and sharing with our networks key information in regards to those schemes. But this is something that should be done by the government in order to comply with their public sector equality duty. In the midst of this public health crisis, we are seeing the damaging effects of the hostile environment and how it is leaving migrant women incredibly vulnerable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. There are also particular issues for women refugees and asylum seekers, and Priscilla from Women for Refugee Women is going to detail some of the issues that they're seeing now.
Hi, yes, so at Women for Refugee Women, we have about 300 asylum seeking women in our network who basically came to our country for protection. The vast majority of these women have fled some kind of sexual or gender-based violence in their countries of origin. So we're talking about FGM, forced prostitution, forced marriage, rape, and other forms of sexual abuse. Now, a lot of these women who we support are living in a state of absolute poverty. They have been refused asylum, they have no right to work, and they're not receiving any form of state support or housing. So no public funds, but also no asylum support. So to be clear, these these are women who in ordinary times, outside of a public health emergency, are incredibly vulnerable to street homelessness, abuse, exploitation, and illness. Just to highlight, we did a piece of research that was released in February this year, and it was on the experiences of women who were forced into destitution, particularly women who've been refused asylum. And around half of the women we spoke to for that research had slept outside at some point. About a third had been raped or sexually abused in their country of origin, and then raped or sexually abused again in the UK whilst destitute. We also heard stories from women who were forced into transactional sex and abusive relationships in exchange for shelter, or because it meant that they wouldn't go hungry, perhaps. The vast majority of women who were abused or exploited in some way were simply unable to seek help from the authorities because of very real fears of being placed in immigration detention. The hostile environment, we know that has led to increased data sharing between the police and the Home Office. Another thing to highlight is the kind of mental health of the women that we deal with. For this piece of research, a third of women had tried to kill themselves, and others had tried to self-harm, and nearly all had said that they had become depressed whilst they were destitute. In the current outbreak, these women are more vulnerable than ever, and like many of the groups in this webinar, we've also shifted to supporting the women in our network via telephone, kind of identifying emergency needs and making referrals and so on. So just to kind of highlight some of the challenges that the women are experiencing. So there are severe issues in accessing food across the board. As usual, sources of support like charities and food banks shut down or struggle to meet an unprecedented demand among a growing vulnerable population. The women are, we're hearing from women who are struggling to feed themselves and their families. At the same time, small hardship payments that were, that were provided by charities that are a lifeline for destitute women who receive no form of support are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get in the current context with the restrictions on movement. And bearing in mind that most of the women we work with don't have bank accounts that payments can be transferred to. In terms of housing, we've got women who are struggling to self-isolate safely. To just give you one example, I'll call her Anna. One woman we spoke to, Anna, we spoke to weeks ago, was being mocked, and she was no longer able to stay there because of concerns with the virus spreading, and was asked to leave. She was then made street homeless. And in short, we took all possible measures to get her a place that night. We tried to contact the local authority, we reached out to a homelessness service, we called hotels and hostels, all of them, they were either full or were only accepting key workers or referrals from designated organisations. And as a result, Anna spent 3 nights sleeping outside on night buses and in a central London park. Among those women who are struggling to self-isolate are also women with serious underlying health conditions, women who, according to government guidance, need to be taking extra care. So we're talking about women who've got HIV, diabetes, severe asthma, heart disease. And meanwhile, emerging data suggests that Black and minority ethnic women are at increased risk of suffering severe reactions to COVID as compared to white women. Another issue to highlight is the lack of phone credit and data. It's a real problem for women who, because of that, are unable to access up-to-date kind of official guidance from the government or reach out to community members or other local groups for help. And that's particularly an issue for the women in our network who don't have a sufficient grasp of English. Being able to call someone in their community, someone they know for help or to find out what's going on is really crucial for their safety at the moment. Lastly, I suppose I want to also highlight that, we've been hearing from women who are forced into exploitative and abusive conditions. So again, to give you one example, I'll call her Bernadette. We spoke to her a few weeks ago. She was staying in an overcrowded house. She was forced to cook and clean for everyone in exchange for shelter. And she was sharing her room with a man who she did not know. And again, this is a woman who's a survivor of sexual violence. And Bernadette has tried to take her own life in the past since being forced into destitution. So, you know, we're talking about women who are really vulnerable and are highly traumatized, being exposed to further abuse and trauma during COVID. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. Noreen is going to talk from the perspective of Foleshill Women's training about that they are working with, particularly around health issues.
Thank you, Mary-Ann. I think I wanted to echo some of the things that Sarah, Priscilla and Pragna have talked about. I think there's a lot of overlap with the organisations and the work that we do, the fantastic work that we do working with migrants and BME communities. Historically, FWT have supported women that are potentially are isolated, disadvantaged, vulnerable in society, migrant women, people that are refugees, asylum seekers, and their circumstances before the COVID virus was very bad anyway. Higher rates of child poverty, employed in low-paid jobs, or for example, unemployed. Low skilled, lack of lots and lots of issues and barriers that we as an organisation have tried to overcome. Those issues are still there. However, they've been exacerbated during the COVID virus. And what we're finding is that the primary issue for a lot of women that we're speaking to now, we've had to work remotely and on the phone, is access. Access to services, particularly around health, has been our primary aim to try and get women to access services, because there's a massive barrier between accessing services and getting the health treatment and health support needed. With a lot of the services that FWT offer around social health, education and employment, it's around need-based, it's around the needs of the woman. And it's very difficult to try and do that at the moment, not being able to offer face-to-face support. So having to move remotely and working on the phone in itself has been a barrier. However, we've been trying to overcome that as much as possible. There's a lack of equipment, digital literacy with women, so it's very difficult sometimes to pass over the COVID information. Initially, what we were finding was the messages around COVID and social isolation weren't getting through, but luckily there's been information available in various languages, and that's been passed over, and a lot of people are sort of understanding the messages now. But the circumstances that people are living in is very, very difficult. Anxiety, social isolation has been exacerbated. We're finding a lot of women that we're speaking to are so anxious, they're so isolated, more so than they were before, because of the social distancing, and because of the lack of services that they can access on a face-to-face basis, and not having that support network around them to be able to support them. So we're offering solutions where we can on the phone. If people haven't got access to digital, an iPad or a laptop, they would try and send things through WhatsApp. So we're trying to come up with alternative solutions to offer that problem, solutions to the problem. There are situations where women are dependent on a partner in an abusive relationship. So therefore we're trying to come up with working with our partners, Coventry Haven and various other partners within the city to support those women to ensure that they're safe. Other social, cultural, family barriers are there and exist there, and I suppose that has a barrier in itself to health. I think with regards to the health services and how we're supporting women, one of our biggest projects is supporting women in pregnancy and early childhood. And as we know, women that have no recourse to public funds have to pay, or those people who haven't got an immigration status that's secure have to pay for treatment. So it's at this moment in time, we know with COVID testing, women can go for free. However, a lot of women are very fearful to access services. So it's trying to ensure that we're giving the key messages out there and ensuring that those women are supported. We're offering alternative clinics at the moment, where we've done extraordinary clinics where we offer face-to-face support for pregnant women because they're particularly vulnerable in this time. And we're doing that in conjunction with midwifery, and that's supporting women with lots of messages, not just around health, but around networks and agencies and links to link those particular women to support out in the community. think one of the things that Sarah touched upon was the fact that as a lot of the key workers are from migrant groups or BME groups, they're having to go out to work, and a lot of the women are experiencing stress, especially if they're living within an extended family network, whereby the key workers are coming back home and they're very scared about their own families and about contracting the coronavirus itself. Unfortunately, we also know that coronavirus is very high within certain groups, particularly BME groups, and I know the government's going to launch a report around that. And it's linked to sort of socioeconomic effects. It's also linked to the fact that a lot of the women that we're supporting, those vulnerable migrant women, are living in deprived areas, maybe having low paid work, and therefore are more vulnerable and more susceptible to catching the coronavirus, unfortunately. But it also links back to the work that we've been doing around prevention and health inequalities. These issues existed before the coronavirus anyway, but the fact that it's been highlighted with the same communities being affected by COVID just highlights what we need to really do to address health inequalities.
Thank you, Noreen. Kate, can we come to you now and ask you both what you're seeing from your constituents, but also anything that's coming up through the all-party parliamentary group on no recourse?
Thank you, Marianne. Well, one of the hidden costs of the lockdown, you know, as everyone has, you know, alluded to and has spoken very eloquently on, domestic abuse. My constituents, Marianne Ishmael, she was 57, and she basically was bludgeoned to death by her husband, who claims the reason that he did this is because she asked him to leave because he said he had coronavirus. So, you know, it's unbelievable that women are having to live in this kind of, you know, insecure environment and have no rights in their own home to be able to speak up and then, you know, pay the price because of that. But this is just one case, and, you know, and unfortunately there will be many more, and we're going to have to, you know, speak about this continually until we make sure that every woman is able to use her voice without, you know, fear of losing her life, which is, you know, outrageous. And I just want to really just touch down on a few things which are, you know, we're doing as parliamentarians. One of the things is making sure in this lockdown that we're able to ask the ministers direct questions. And as you all can see, we're using this kind of virtual way of getting our voice across. But one of the other stronger ways is writing to them and asking them questions. So one of the main questions I asked was to the Minister for Housing and Communities to say that, can you ensure that everybody that is homeless, that's not just rough sleepers, that's anyone who is in accommodation, which is difficult to self-isolate, is living or staying in a included, and especially women who have no recourse to public funds. Is my speaker working?
Your speaker's been cutting in and out a little bit, I think.
A message keeps coming up saying
now.
Okay, all right then. Maybe I'll shout a bit in the house. Is that a bit better now?
The other thing that you might find, which is a bit of a pain, but if you put your video off, sometimes the audio gets better because it's not.
Okay, I can do that.
We can come back to you. We've got a picture of you anyway, I think.
Is that better? Okay, let me do this then. You can see me anyway. So one of the things which was really important to make sure the minister has said.
I'm sorry, Kate, you're still breaking up.
Oh my God!
Out. Stay where you are exactly now. Don't move your head and try speaking from there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, I'm not going to move my body. I'm going to try and talk quickly and cut out. I'll tell you, the internet is terrible. So just quickly as possible, is just to say that this question was asked and the minister said that also women with no recourse to public funds will be included. So that is a message that needs to get across to all of the organisations. However, anecdotally, we're hearing and we're getting evidence from many charities suggesting that many local authorities are failing to implement this directive. But it is there. and it's important that it's used. And this is part of the information which we need as the all-party group to be collecting. So if there's any cases where a local authority is not making sure that a family that has no recourse to public funds is not included within that directive, then that local authority is in breach. So I think that's just one of the things that we're doing as an all-party group. We're also writing to Education Secretary, speaking about, asking them questions about families that have no recourse to public funds, and the children who now, because the school is closed, will not be getting maybe that breakfast or that lunch or, you know, the evening meal. They've said that they will be included in the vulnerable families. Now, all of this shows you that prior to this lockdown, these families should have been included. They shouldn't be this second-class, two-tier system which is in place. And this is something which shows you that it's all a political choice. It's got nothing to do with humanity. It's got nothing to do with fairness. It just shows that they will make a decision, as in the Tory government or the coalition government. They will come together and they will only cater for those people who they believe are worthy. And this is something which the all-party group is picking up. And I know that all of the charities and all of the people, that panelists that have spoken today, have brought this up. But this lockdown on one side is obviously it's life-threatening, and people, you know, are going through hell. But it also shows that if they really do care about the community, if they do want to stop the spread of the virus, as they claim they want to do, they can make sure that everybody is safe. But it's not good enough, because we all know that if it wasn't for, you know, the charity sector, the mosque, the church, a lot of these women would have nowhere, literally nowhere. And it's not right. We need to do better than that. And I just want to talk a little bit about what's happening in my local hospital. I've got a lot of people, you know, from BME communities that are working in the hospital. The chief executive has written to me and has said that they are taking it very seriously at this stage, that BME communities are the ones at the front line. They're the ones more at risk, and they're the ones losing their life. So when there is a will, there is a way. But not every hospital trust is speaking in that language. A lot of them are saying we're still trying to get the data. We know what the data is. We've seen it. We're seeing what's happening. And we also know, especially in London settings, there's more BME communities that live there. So, you know, they will more likely be in the NHS. So we're not shocked that they are losing their lives. We're not shocked because they're the ones who are doing the work. But what we're shocked by is that this government have said that they were prepared for the COVID, you know, a virus, and they had everything in place, despite, as we all know, as people have said before, that there is no protection. People are not, you don't have the right PPE. So not only are they sending people to work, knowing fully well they do not have the protection, they're also sending people to work that look like me, you know, and that's what hurts me. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across, is that's where my passion lies, is that, yes, I'm a member of parliament, but I need to continue to speak up for those communities which are the ones who are least likely to have a voice. And I just hope that with the support of the charities that are doing the work, and having more colleagues within parliament who are speaking up for those people who have no recourse to public funds, as an example, we can come through this and learn some lessons, because we need to change the course of action for many people's lives. And the sooner we do that, the better. Hopefully I didn't cut out there.
Thank you very much, Kate. No, we got all of that loud and clear. Thank you very much. So what we're seeing is a devastating situation for very many migrant women in terms of their basic safety, vulnerability to violence and potentially death, to their broader health issues, to their employment rights, their poverty, to their ability to feed themselves and their families. But one of the things that's very clear is that this is not a new problem that's been created by COVID-19. This is a problem that's been thrown into stark relief by COVID-19, and sometimes the lockdown has exacerbated existing problems, but those problems were there before this crisis, and there were problems to do with our immigration system and our social security system, and the broader hostile environment. I want to make sure that we get time for questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do is ask the panelists to combine kind of answers to the last two questions we were going to ask, which is basically, you know, what are the wider problems that have made this COVID-19 crisis particularly difficult for migrant women to deal with, and what can we do differently? What do we need to do differently so that people can live their lives with dignity and financial autonomy and be safe from harm? And I'm going to mix the order up a little bit. So I'll start with Priscilla talking specifically about refugee and asylum seeking women, and then go on to Noreen. So Priscilla first.
Thanks, Marianne. So as I said, the women in our network have basically fled gender-based violence and come to our country for refuge. And as you said, you know, they're then put through a broken asylum system is the best way to describe it. A system that's overwhelmed, that's target focused, that, as we've seen from numerous reports over the years, too often treats asylum seeking people with disbelief, so that, you know, an unrealistically high and unlawful burden is put on them to prove that they deserve refuge. But I suppose just to highlight that, you know, women are disadvantaged on an additional level, if you like, because of their gender. So we've seen from studies that, you know, women are often kind of faced with caseworkers who lack a sufficient, caseworkers at the Home Office, sorry, who lack a sufficient understanding of, you know, gender-based violence, how that affects a woman's ability to tell her story of persecution, and how that sort of harm fits, you know, falls within the UK's obligation to grant asylum. And especially when we're talking about private violence, violence at the hands of family and community members as opposed to the state. So yeah, the asylum system and case processing is an issue. And then there's also exacerbating that is the fact that the legal aid landscape has really been disseminated since 2005, such that now it's incredibly difficult to get quality and free representation, even for a first-time asylum applicant. To quote some brilliant research that was done by Refugee Action, since 2005, about 64% of legal aid providers and 56% of not-for-profit entities have ceased providing representation. So that's huge. And so the result is that women and men who might be entitled to refugee status end up being refused and then forced into destitution. You know, and this is a deliberate government policy that's designed to push them to leave the UK, you know, just putting vulnerable and traumatized men and women into an absolute state of poverty, as I said, so they have no right to work and no form of state support or housing. But at the heart of all this is, you know, a hostility towards asylum-seeking people and migrants, and a hostility that has really been there for years, way before 2012. I won't go into too much detail, but if you look at the history of asylum and immigration legislation, you'll see that governments on both the left and the right have sort of hacked away at basic protections for those seeking asylum, and particularly for those who are at the end of the process who've been refused, such that now we have a system where women who have fled extreme human rights abuses are basically being pushed into hunger, homelessness, and further sexual abuse. And even those who are in the asylum system are receiving what? They're forced to live on the equivalent of £5.39 a day to cover everything from food, soap, period pads, phone credit, bus travel. You know, the cost of living continues to rise, but this amount, according to Refugee Action, is lower than it was 18 years ago. And once you're refused, you don't even get that meagre support. So how did we get to a place where this is okay? That's the question that needs to be asked, and the hostility that needs to be dismantled.
Thank you, Priscilla. Are there particular things that Women for Refugee Women are calling for at the moment?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, what we would really like to see is leave to remain, so that everyone, men and women with insecure immigration status, can access support, housing, healthcare, and the labour market for the duration of the pandemic. So we've seen in Portugal, for example, that the government there has agreed to regularise the status of people with pending immigration applications, which is really positive. But of course, if you just focus on those who have applications, you're failing to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So, any form of leave to remain should include not just those with pending applications, but also people who are undocumented who have been refused. If there's a way that, this can be sort of, if a fast track system can be put into place where people can have their status regularised quickly, this could be a really pragmatic and efficient way of protecting people in a public health emergency. And that, also needs to be accompanied by measures to ensure that once that status is regularised, that there's immediate access then to safe housing and support for all those who need it. I can talk about
Thank you.
an additional.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I want to make sure that other people have a chance to speak. Noreen, can you say a little bit about the kind of broader context and anything in particular that FWT thinks needs to happen now?
I think all the things that Priscilla touched upon around sort of challenging hostile environment for migrant women in general needs to be challenged by all of our agencies, and we need to look at that collectively. Scrapping the no recourse to public funds, really, as it's very discriminatory. It leaves women destitute, and not just for the COVID crisis, but I think generally anyway. I think asylum seekers themselves should be able to work. I think at the moment, with a lot of projects that we support FWT, eligibility criteria is usually attached to the targets and to the projects. We've been quite fortunate where we've come up with innovative solutions at FWT to try and provide things like conversational English for asylum seekers or people who have no immigration status or paperwork to back up their status here in the UK. But if we had that all scrapped, it'd be access to all, and therefore there'd be a fair way for people to progress. And at FWT, what we try and do with confidence partnerships is to ensure that those women have a wraparound service, a seamless service, so women can move forward and get the services they need to become more independent, to be more integrated. I think putting these barriers up actually makes people more reliant on state services, and I think we're trying to get more getting women independent by scrapping a lot of the of those legislations that we've got in place at the moment. I think with regards to maternity services, it's ensuring women who are not documented to have free access to maternal care is so important, such a vulnerable time in a person's life. We know that the high suicide rate postnatally for women after they've given birth is suicide. It's the highest death for women the first year after birth. So perinatal mental health is so important, and having a woman having debts and having to pay debts at that crucial time while she's given birth to a baby, it's exacerbating to that situation and increasing stress levels. And so that's something that we recommend that should be sort of scrapped. I think with regards to, it's recognising and celebrating what migrant women and how they contribute to society. I think at the moment, with the state of economy, we know that the key workers are from migrant communities, a lot of them, and we need to celebrate what they're doing at the moment rather than having this negative rhetoric around migrant workers. We have so much negativity in the press, and we have so much negativity and hate crime because of what's the unfair and inaccurate reports that we see in the press about migrant workers and their contribution to society. We need to celebrate that now more so than ever, as our NHS workers, our key workers, a high proportion of those are from BAMI and migrant communities. I think with regards to recognising the women's sector and how we contribute to society at the moment, the fact that the charities, the voluntary organisations have come forward during the COVID crisis just shows really how important and vital our services are and how crucial funding is to support that going forward. We're very lucky at FWT in the sense that we've got various funded projects, including Smallwood, that's recognised the partnership. We've also had European funding come for our employability projects to support migrant women. With Brexit, unfortunately, that in a few years that funding won't be there. So it's thinking about how can that be replaced, and what can the national government here in the UK do about filling that gap and that need. And I think it's just recognising and acknowledging culturally sensitive support and accessibility that we have as agencies to women across communities, really. And I just wanted to finish off just by saying about the inequalities and the health inequalities that I touched upon earlier. I think the government needs to provide further support, really, with a decade of austerity, to look at the structural problems in society which have led to these inequalities, and in particular the differences in how long we've been living richer and poorer areas across the country for such a long time. I've been working in health for about 20 years now, and I haven't seen that change much. I know Coventry are doing a fantastic job because we're a marmot city. We're looking at the inequalities agenda at a strategic level, where FWT is represented on the group. We're looking at a multi-agency approach. We're looking at poverty. We're looking at economics as well as health, and that's how cities really need to address it. But it needs to come from government. We need to really look at what we can do better with regards to life expectancy, especially the massive gap that we've got between the poor and the rich.
Thank you, Noreen. Pragna, I was going to ask you, as well as talking more generally about the challenges that migrant women face and what should be done, if you could explain a little bit about what no recourse to public funds means, because I know that a lot of the audience will understand that term, but some people might not be familiar with it. So if you could just give a bit of background. You need to switch your mic on.
I knew that would happen if I muted myself. No recourse to public funds is effectively an immigration policy that successive governments have followed, which basically says that if you're in this country, a condition can be attached upon your stay here, which is that you remain here temporarily until your immigration status is regularized, and in the meantime you're not entitled to claim any benefits, any public funds. And what constitutes public funds are most forms of non-contributory benefits and social housing, including housing association housing, local authority housing. So it effectively bars migrant people with that who have subject to no recourse to public funds from accessing public support in moments of crisis. So in the context of violence against women and girls, you know, most women rely on some form of welfare support when they exit from abuse. But if they have that no recourse to public funds attached to their stay, then they cannot seek any form of public assistance, which, as most people have outlined here in this discussion, plunges them into poverty and destitution and homelessness. And so one of the reasons why most of us are exercised about the no recourse to public funds requirement is that it is a form of institutionalized destitution. It is a form of institutionalized discrimination. And it is part of the hostile environment policies that governments have pursued, as people have outlined. And I agree with Priscilla and Noreen and others who are saying that really, you know, in the short term, what we really need to see happen is a lifting of the no recourse to public funds condition. I am actually absolutely angry and appalled at the fact that in this moment of crisis, which impacts on all levels of society without discrimination, the government has chosen to maintain and pursue hostile immigration policies, including not lifting no recourse to public funds, because that does impact, as people have said, on access to protection, on access to justice, on access to health, on access to housing. And I frankly have no trust in this government. We have heard announcements after announcements after announcements of how they're making funding available to local authorities, to this person, that body, this organization, to deal with supporting vulnerable people. That vulnerable people has never been explicitly referenced to include no recourse people, migrant people with no recourse to public funds or asylum seekers. And so for me, until there is explicit reference by this government to say that whatever additional funding they're making available, whether it's to deal with VOG issues, whether it's to deal with, rough sleepers or homelessness, until and unless they also explicitly reference that that money is to go to supporting migrant people, families, abused women, others with no recourse to public funds, I don't trust. I do not trust that that money is where it will go. And we've seen it on a daily basis, 6 weeks since the lockdown, I believe. We have seen how local authorities are interpreting their duties strictly, how many other statutory bodies, including funding bodies, are the last, are not providing funds for migrant women with no recourse to have safe accommodation. What they tell us, and this is an experience I've had just this week from London MOPAC, what they've said is we're very nervous about providing support to abuse migrant women with no recourse, because what will happen afterwards when the lockdown is over? What will we do with them? And so that's what I mean when I say the burden of responsibility has shifted to the BME women's organizations, because it is for us to guarantee that they will have move-on accommodation. It is us who are saying we will take responsibility. That should not be the case. We should be being provided, migrant women with no recourse should be provided with services on the basis of need and not their immigration status. How can it be right for anyone to say we will provide funding, but we only want to limit the number of people we help with no recourse because we don't know what will happen afterwards and we can't take responsibility afterwards? And you, the BME sector, the BME Vogue sector, what are you going to do to move them on? That's the conversations I've been having with MOPAC this week. And it is unacceptable, untenable that they should be treating, that we should have a system of welfare support, a system of funding that is geared towards excluding migrant women with no recourse, not including, even in these times of crisis. And I find that the whole way in which the hostile immigration climate, the whole way in which the commissioning structures, which always favor generic services, and there is no reason to believe that additional funding will not go to the very generic services that already have the money and not to the BME specialist support services that need the money. There is, the combination of commissioning structures that are discriminatory, the combination of the hostile environment with the crisis that we're facing at the moment effectively means that we are saying that there are only some groups who are willing to help and that the rest are disposable. And it just beggars belief, actually, that 6 weeks into the lockdown, we find ourselves as BME women's organizations going with a begging bowl and saying to farmers, please include migrant women with no recourse, saying to government, please include migrant women with no recourse. This is what we've been reduced to. It makes me very angry, and it makes me feel that the only thing that will change is our own ability to stand up and say, we're not going to take this anymore. We're not prepared to tolerate this anymore. I really want to see, immediately, I want to see no recourse lifted. I want to see references, explicit references to funding for migrant women with no recourse to public funds. But in the long term, apart from the fact that the domestic violence abuse should pick up on this and make sure that they create a system of support that includes migrant women with no recourse. The other thing I really want to see come out of this is a formal inquiry, not just at how BME groups are affected by the COVID crisis because they are providers of frontline services, but also how BME groups are affected because they are users of those services. And I think only a formal inquiry can help us expose the kind of discrimination that we're facing, the kind of exclusion that we're facing, which is really marginalizing groups even more. We really have to reorder the way in which we work, and some real lessons have to be learned. I hope that we will carry on, all of us here on this panel and others, you know, in trying to make sure that those lessons are learned.
Thank you very, very much, Pragna. We've got some questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to go to Elizabeth and Sarah and Kate briefly, and then see if we can get some questions in via Jenna from the audience. So Elizabeth, the original question we're looking at was kind of how do the problems we're seeing now link to pre-existing issues, and what needs to be done differently?
Yeah, so I agree on what everyone has said until now. From the perspective of employment rights, I think it's important to talk about the other structural factors that women were facing before this crisis and that are getting exacerbated during this crisis. In the case of Latin American women, we know how the language barrier or difficulties in transferring skills or lack of recognition of degrees and qualifications play out an important role on how women are positioned in vulnerable positions with very limited options for working. Just as an example, last year at Lords, we published the Unheard Workforce, which is a report that gathered the experiences of our service users over a period of 3 years working in sectors such as cleaning, hospitality, and domestic work. And what we found in this report was alarming levels of exploitation and abuse, and that exploitation is in fact endemic in these sectors. What we know is that the vulnerability that migrant women face at the workplace is worsened by discriminatory responses and policies which prevent them from accessing support and justice, and which have put immigration enforcement above safety. So what can we do different? Just following what just Pragna said, from Lords, we advocate and we work for a fair immigration system that it's built hand to hand with specialists by BME and migrant buy and force services whose work is evidence-based. We are calling on the government to place human rights and women's rights above immigration control. And for that, we need an immediate suspension of data sharing between all statutory services, including the police, healthcare services, and employment inspectorates, and the Home Office to protect vulnerable workers and victims of crime. We really hope that the government will ensure lessons and learn from this pandemic and the unequal impact that it's having on migrants, so that, for instance, the domestic abuse bill and the immigration bill are informed by all these issues raised during this time by organizations like ours. And just to close, the hostile environment has made life more difficult for migrants in many ways. But this crisis has shown that what they call low-paid migrants are in fact carrying out essential jobs, and the nation is in much need of them. However, when speaking about this, it's important to highlight that when we address migrants' contribution, we never forget the human part of migration, because we as migrants should not only be seen, heard, and valued as a result of our economic contributions. And this is very important to be included in any single debate we are having around migration. So just that.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. I think that is a very important point. It's very, very, it's hugely valuable at the moment to say people who've been seen as unskilled because they're low paid are actually vital to the running of the economy. But people are entitled to be treated with respect for their human rights and decency and humanity, regardless of what contribution they make to the economy on the basis of being human. Sarah, do you want to say a little bit about the kind of pre-existing challenges? I know you touched on that in your first answer, and what set out some of the things that the Women's Budget Group with partners are calling for.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. I think most of what I wanted to say has already been said very, very well, eloquently. So I'll just add very briefly that I think it's very useful to look at this, or what we're seeing, the impact that we're seeing of this crisis as sort of a collision of this crisis with pre-existing crises that we had before COVID-19 outbreak. And I think part of that is understanding how the immigration system rules are set, and also the intention behind them, which we usually call the hostile environment. And I think one of the things that the immigration system does is privileging certain types of migrants, particularly workers, and specific types of workers. So what is conventionally understood as high-skilled workers, people who come to earn very high wages are welcome. And so it sort of, the immigration system is designed to ensure that people are self-sufficient, or it's the aim is for people to be self-sufficient. But the problem is that it puts a lot of barriers at the same time for that self-sufficiency to occur. And I think we see this in many contradictions that were mentioned already by many speakers, including the fact that asylum seekers cannot work. So while they're waiting for the results of their application, you know, Noreen mentioned that many classes, ESOL classes, for instance, which are meant to improve language skills of particularly migrant people, they are not free if you have no recourse to public funds. So how are you supposed to, you know, improve your skills to be able to integrate, to be able to contribute to the economy? Even something that hasn't been mentioned here as well, but I think it's important from an economic perspective, which is the fact that migrant women who have no recourse to public funds, many of them have no entitlement to the full 30-hour free entitlement to childcare for their children. So what this means is that if they have caring responsibilities, they cannot participate fully in the labor market, so they cannot support themselves and their families through wages because they have those caring responsibilities, in the formal structures to support that childcare are not in place or are barred to them. And also, as has been mentioned here, the fact that we bar most migrants from accessing public funds, which include most welfare benefits. But you know, this is something that many workers rely on as a supplement to their earnings from work, because in-work poverty is rife in the UK at the moment. And so, as an example, a third of people who are on universal credit are also in paid work, but simply they cannot earn enough from those jobs to support themselves and their families, so they have to rely on social security. And this is something that is barred for most migrants. So I think moving now to the recommendations and what we'd like to see, I think scrapping no recourse to public funds is a fundamental one that has already been mentioned by the other speakers. I think at this point in time it should absolutely be suspended, at least, because we are in a situation where we need to encourage people not to go to work if it isn't essential, but we need to provide those people with the financial security to be able to do so. And so it's important that everyone has access to that safety net to be able to make those decisions safely. And also, in the medium to longer term, it needs to be reviewed and it needs to be eventually scrapped, because there's evidence as well that it has a disproportionate impact on women and on disabled people and on young people as well, because all of these groups are more likely to be in low-paid employment, and they also face extra barriers to work. In the case of women in general, it will be carrying responsibilities. For disabled people, it will be they are barred from accessing certain types of programs and support from government to adapt, to allow their employers to adapt their workplace to be able to have a job. And so this has a disproportionate impact on these groups because of those extra barriers. And just as a final point, I think as other speakers have highlighted, I think a reckoning is due in terms of how we treat migrant women. They are an undervalued group, as we've seen, but they are also overrepresented, as this crisis has shown. They are overrepresented in keeping our society afloat. So it's important that we as a society have a reckoning on what sorts of skills, what sorts of jobs we value, and we value also the contribution that migrants give to our society, not just on the economic side, but also, culturally, socially enriching the UK society. And as Elizabeth mentioned, very importantly, also recognizing that at the end of the day, we're all human, and we should all have access to a decent living standard.
Thank you, Sarah. Kate, you mentioned in your first contribution some of the issues that you're raising with ministers. Are there any other particular issues that you've been raising, or anything that you've been particularly calling for right now?
Well, one of the main things at this point to focus on is the domestic abuse bill, and it in its form as it sits now, it's not meaningful. It doesn't rectify or address the significant and additional barriers faced by migrant women in accessing safety and support. And I think everything that has been said by all the panelists is really important, but my focus as a legislator is to not only speak up for women, and families, full stop, but more importantly, work with the sector and encourage them to participate yet again in, fact-finding, data sharing experience that the government is asking all of you to do. And, as much as we have done it before, and we've, given them all the data and they've got all the information, they're asking for it again. And the minister, the government minister, in closing, she actually put that down and said, I'm asking you to join in. So please, that's one of my calls, is to just get involved. It's not adequate, but if it means that we can help somebody, let's just join hands and be part of that. So that's my main sort of thing. And I know we haven't got a lot of time, but everything that's been said before, I just want to pick up on one of the things that Pragna said around having a wider inquiry. It's paramount. We need to make sure that happens, because the lessons learned from this have to mean that people's lives improved, especially when we look at the health inequalities and the issues which a lot of the people on the front line experience on a day-to-day basis. So that I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Kate. We've had various conversations coming in on the chat, which Jenna from the Women's Budget Group has been monitoring. Jenna, I don't know if you want to summarise some of the key questions that have come up, and we can put those back to the panellists. We've only got 10 minutes, so.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone,
Jenna,
for your questions and contributions. I think lots of the questions that we've had relate to what individuals can do to support both the organisations here today's work, but also, as Kate says, kind of support opposition and members of the government to make changes on some of these things. So it'd be great to hear from panellists on what individual things people can do, whether it be write to MPs, sign petitions, donate time or money to organisations, etc. And then we've also had a question on whether or not, so there has been some money announced to charities by the Treasury to support organisations struggling to cope with COVID, and some of that has been, there is a smaller pot for domestic abuse and sexual violence charities. However, none of that has been ring-fenced for BME and migrant women. And someone from the audience has asked whether or not the panelists and Kate, yourself also, agree that some of that money should be ring-fenced and how we might make that happen. And I'm just looking.
I think that may be all we have time for.
That sums up most of the questions.
Those are the two main questions. Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panelists in turn those two questions. What can people do? And specifically about the ring fencing of money for the VORG sector for by and for BME organisations. We've only got 10 minutes, so if you can keep your answers fairly short. I will start with Priscilla. What can people do?
Hi. Yeah, I think what I would really like to see is people writing to MPs for this temporary leave to remain I mentioned for those with an insecure immigration status. I think I just saw that one of the people in the audience, Lorraine, talked about sort of including people with lived experience, and I could not agree with that more, and it's really at the heart of what we do at Women for Refugee Women. Women who've gone through the asylum and immigration status need to be supported to share their stories of persecution directly, but also to kind of shape and direct campaigns on the issues that affect them. I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to dismantle the sort of fundamental societal structures that have, you know, like racism and sexism that have led to the injustices that migrant women are facing until they're not only heard in a meaningful way, but are leading advocacy efforts. And that's, you know, something like temporary leave to remain is really important because of the access to support and housing and access to the labour market. People who are struggling for survival on a daily basis aren't going to be able to fully immerse themselves into campaigning and activism if they don't know where they'll sleep that night or, you know, where their next meal will come from. So yeah, on our side, you know, to push for that leave to remain would be really, really great. And I'll hand over to others before I take up all the time.
Elizabeth?
So I would say that people can get in touch with community by and for services. We are in a lot of need of donations, but also for people to contribute. We, as I said before, we are working a lot on translating resources for our service users. So we need some time for people who are free to and keen to collaborate with our services. We, I think it's important in general that people help us to put this information outside these circles, because sometimes I feel that a lot of people are not getting informed around on how migrant women are struggling in this around this crisis. So I think that would be important. And with regards to the funding from LORS and the Step Up Migrant Women campaign that we coordinate, we have been supporting this call on the government for ring-fence, flexible and unrestricted funding for organizations like ours. Because as Pragna mentioned before, the system that this money is distributed put organizations like ours and smaller organizations in lots of difficulties. Applying for funding takes a lot of time, and we are small teams, and we are dealing with increased workload. So we really need this money to be ring-fenced as the call that has been sent, and we support. So that's all I would say.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Noreen?
I think with regards to how people can support, it's raising the awareness as much as possible. I think contacting MPs, contacting commissioners, ensuring people are aware, have that sort of whole policy of the issues that are going on, and raising them at different platforms and arenas where possible. I know we're very lucky with Coventry's partnership, and we've got a unique partnership, and the research that's been done is actually a valuable tool and it's about sharing all that resource that we've actually managed to sort of create within the partnership itself. I think Marianne and Sarah and everybody else, I think, with Women's Budget Group and the partners would agree that we've been very lucky that we've been in this position where we've had the actual commissioning to be able to highlight issues like this, because funding is very, very difficult to come by. So it's actually highlighting where possible, and the partners on the panel and all the partners are involved in supporting migrant women and the BME agenda. Really, is trying to support them where possible. Some are voluntary organisations, some are commissioned separately. Some have smaller organisations, some are larger. So it's approaching them individually to see what you could do to partner up, to see if you can highlight the issue and work together collectively on this area. With regards to ring fencing and funding, is so important for this brilliant work and this crucial work to continue. And all that we can say is that we recommend that funding is ring fenced, particularly for those organisations that are working on the ground and have that connection with those communities and are doing this fantastic vital work.
Thank you, Noreen. Pragna.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what people are saying I would support. I think a number of things we could do. One is for individuals who are not linked to organisations, I think it would be fantastic if you come across every instance, any instance of injustice in relation to migrant women with no recourse to public funds, or migrant families not being able to access support, to be able to jot that down in a postcard, send it to your MP and send it to the government. If they want evidence, we should give them the evidence. And it's really important that we highlight, even as women's organisations, that we highlight this in every forum and opportunity that we have. And yes, you know, we always have to restate our case again and again and again. That's the nature of the beast, as it were. But we can do that. We all have examples. We all have the ability to make sure that we're there in those forums saying these things. So as individuals, highlight every case of injustice, make it known to us. We'd be happy if you drop postcards to us saying, here's a case, this is what happened, that's what happened. We collect all that, and when we present evidence, whether it's at the APPG meeting or some of the other parliamentary committees or anywhere else, we can gather that information and use it. That's the first thing. Secondly, if you're a women's organisation, I think it would be wonderful to show some solidarity to Black women's organisations by asking all your funders to start with, where is the funds for migrant women, before you ask for any other funds. And I think the problem we have is we're also played off against each other. It is so vital that we see the way in which the government, the litmus test for this government in dealing with this crisis has to be how it treats its vulnerable people. And as BME women's organisations, we could do with a bit of solidarity, particularly from the larger generic Vogue organisations, you know, that are more advantageous, in a more advantageous position in terms of getting funding, at the expense of the smaller BME specialist sector. So this round of funding that the government has announced at the weekend, £76 million to go to various, you know, to support various domestic abuse charities. It would be fantastic if the main generic Vogue organisation said, can we start with what you're doing for the specialist sector first? And we can work with that, you know? And we don't see that. And that's part of the problem. The funding that exists will go to the generic services, will go to the services that already have contacts and influence with government. And that's not how it should be. It should be based on need. So that's the second thing I would say. And generally, you know, we must use the opportunity provided by the Domestic Abuse Bill to try and bring about some long-term changes here. So any way people can support us as we, you know, go through the stages of the Domestic Abuse Bill would be really appreciated. All of us are working in our own way around these issues. On our website, please keep in touch. We have news, we have developments, we have letters to which we need sign up, you know, and campaigns that we're all running. They're all linked. We're all, you know, part of one big campaign in a way, even if we take up different issues. So, you know, all of us could do with that kind of support too.
Thank you, Pragna. Kate, you talked a bit already about people feeding issues into the government inquiry. Is there anything else that you would like to say that people can do?
What I would also say is, well, I mean, to be fair, everything has been said, but there are lots of allies amongst the members of parliament, and a lot of that is because they are seeing people coming into their surgeries who have no recourse to public funds, but have children that are born in the UK and are in need. And because they're in need, regardless of their parents', immigration status, they should be getting the support. So there are a lot of London, I say London because I'm a London MP, but of course it goes across the whole of the country. There are many MPs who are aware of what is going on. And I think it's joining up, being part of a campaign, but more importantly, encouraging your member of parliament to speak up for those people, speak up for the family, speak up for your friends' children, that because of their parents' immigration status, their child is denied access to basic rights. And I think it's something which people need to bear in mind. It's not only about the parent, it's also about the child, who actually under the law, are entitled to the support, which a lot of them are denied. And just lastly, I just want to say that Stephen Timms, who's the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, he emailed me and he said that he wanted to be part of the all-party group. And I think that's a very good ally, in that he could possibly, I'm saying this out loud, I've not asked him, but he could possibly do an inquiry into how, people, women, families who are being denied access to public funds despite having a child born in the UK, and he could use the Select Committee as a vehicle to reinforce the fact that their support is being denied. So I just want you to know there's a lot of support out there. We just got to bring everyone together, as Pragna said.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much. It's great being part of this.
Thank you. Sarah, I was going to give you the last word with very limited time. What can people do?
I think everything has already been said, and we would fully support what people are saying. I think on the topic of ring fence money for specialist BME organizations, I think, yeah, Pragna put it very well. All the challenges that these organizations are facing. I think it's also important to note that these were also the organizations that were most severely affected by austerity cuts since 2010, and so they are struggling even more than the more general vogue organizations. So it's absolutely crucial that some of this funding is ring-fenced for these organizations, and also that when funding is available, that organizations like Elizabeth mentioned, applying for funding is very costly. It's very it consumes resources that a frontline organization may not be able to spare. And so it's absolutely crucial that this extra funding that is made available doesn't require organizations to jump through multiple hoops to get the money, when it needs to be accessed straight away to support women straight away.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for taking part in what has been an incredibly powerful and moving event. We were planning this to launch the report about a situation that was already very bad, and as Sarah said, we've seen the pre-existing crises around immigration and the social security system collide with the COVID-19 crisis in a way that has made life just really impossible for particular groups of migrant women. We're going to carry on raising these issues. We will be sending out all the links that have been posted on the chat thread to the to the attendees, and any of the speakers who've got anything else that they want us to circulate, we'll circulate. We will be posting a recording of this meeting on our website, along with links to all the organisations that have participated and any campaign pages that they want us to promote on that. And we will, as I said, continue to raise these issues, continue to raise the issues around the domestic abuse bill, and continue to raise these issues in our ongoing work on COVID-19, which we'll be taking forward with Noreen and FWT and other partners in Coventry, where we're kind of doing a deep dive into the issue of the impact of COVID-19 on women more generally, but that will include specific coverage of the issues affecting migrant women. Thank you all to all the audience for your participation and for your questions, and thank you for taking part. Stay safe, everybody, and hope to see everybody in a face-to-face environment at some point in the future. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye.